one of my earliest moments of watching Danielson is probably I was just surfing through YouTube channels and stuff like that, and I saw him against Morishima when he dislocated his retina. I was like, holy shit, that's the fucking craziest thing I've seen in my entire life. And the fact that he just kept going in the entire match was wild, and they kept the craziest pace throughout that entire match, and I was just hooked on him ever since then. Even through different iterations of what he's been, but he's kind of just stayed, in my opinion, the same throughout this entire thing. I think that what kind of separates him from most other professional wrestlers is how especially now, how he like blends different styles together. Like, he kind of had to amend a lot of stuff from when he got to WWE and then when he got hurt. But he's still like pretty true to the American Dragon when it was in the early days of ROH and WXW and stuff like that. And it's like when he came back this last time after Bray Wyatt cut his hair and stuff like that, and he like had a shaved head and the beard and everything. I was like, oh fuck! And he just started doing the stomps and stuff. It was just crazy. Like, he just knows how to get such a big visceral reaction from a crowd. Like, yeah, everyone knows him now, but even then, like, there's kids who are probably like chanting along because he's doing his yes thing, or he's just being really entertaining.
Passion first and foremost is the thing that I think separates Danielson from almost any other wrestler in the last 25 years. You can tell how passionate he is towards the sport. You can tell how passionate he is towards the art. And you can tell how passionate Bryan is about always getting better and always improving. He's a guy that will take something from every opponent he has and incorporate it into his own game to clearly make himself better. On top of that, it's really just connection. He connects with the fans. He connected with the fans as a heel. He connected with the fans as a babyface. He's always had that kind of ideology of how to connect with a fan base. Like I said, I don't think there's a wrestler with better passion, a wrestler that is turning into another gear quicker than Danielson. When Danielson's kicking up his gear. When he's getting ready really to go into the big stuff. I think that's one of his biggest assets is just that passion, that gear switch, and really overall just dedication. Purely a guy who's dedicated his entire life to being the best in the world. My favorite Bryan Danielson performances would probably be the series of Nigel McGuinness matches mixed with the series of Morishima matches. Then therein mixed with, on top of all of that, the Roderick Strong matches. Roderick Strong and Bryan Danielson was a formative rivalry for me, and same with Nigel. I was first discovering independent wrestling in 2005 and 2006, so those two rivalries really kind of like elevated me to like the fandom towards Danielson that I found. And really, like, those are two of the performances that I remember most. In terms of his series. Then you couple that with the Morishima feud, where it was a completely different factor. Usually Danielson was the kind of dickhead heel bully, where now he's got to go against the bigger bully, and how is he going to overcome that bigger bully? What's his game plan going to be? The detached retina, so many storylines there with Morishima, and I just look at all that, and I think that like that all kind of like cannibalizes itself together, and I really think that is the defining stuff for me as a Danielson fan. I'll always talk about his work with ChrisHero and his work inside the ROH CZW feud as a real way to get a guy who was pretty over with the crowd and to get the whole crowd to hate him. And he was so good and so smarmy at doing it. The performances, like I said, against Nigel stand out for a simple reason. just pure great wrestling. Same with Roddy. He was able to always get the best out of those guys and do so much and do so well. You look at his stuff, from '01 with Low Key. That stuff is so ahead of its time in terms of hybrid styling. And the idea of how he was able to incorporate, all of his grappling into that is something that always stood out to me. And in those performances, what stood out to me, like in those, like let's say those Nigel matches, was his ability to not only be a good guy, but also be the bad guy. He was able to turn the crowd with him or against him at any time. A guy like Bryan Danielson has allowed there to be a better technical renaissance in pro wrestling that wasn't really there before. For all the crazy high-flying matches you see, Danielson has proven that he can mix and do everything else with a little bit of everything. The other thing I will say about Danielson that the fans might not see is how he's such a master of pacing. Danielson can get more leeway out of little things than almost any other pro wrestler can. You look at like the Nigel and Danielson match from Epic Encounter 2, and he works a headlock for 20 plus minutes, and the fans are into the headlock. I defy you to find many guys that could pull that off. But he also knows how to bring matches to a crescendo. He knows how to pace a match. He knows how to pace a 60-minute match. He knows how to pace a 10-minute match. Danielson is able to pace a match all across the board almost better than anybody right now, or for that matter, the last 20 to 25 years. So like that's another thing that like the fans might not see that a wrestler should be able to see. But I think also Bryan Danielson and like has taught how to fire up, how to emote, how to make everything bigger than it should be, because that's the key. We're wrestlers, we're larger than life, and I think that's one of the things that Bryan Danielson does so well. Every kick, every hold he trades, everything is larger than life to him in that ring. Because even though he's small in stature, in the ring he's a giant. Everything he does is big, whether it be the head kicks, things like that. And I really just think that like showing a technical prowess can be used throughout the match and in different ways has been a big thing.
Some of my favorite performances that Bryan Danielson has had, I distinctly remember. I think it was called Epic Encounter, was a match with him and AJ Styles in early Ring of Honor being something that I was really drawn to. I remember having a big match feel. It might have been Main Event Spectacles, I'm not sure. I'll have to go through my history books to remember what the name of the event was. But I remember it had a big match feel, and even just from seeing highlights online at the time, it looked really spectacular. He had a series of matches with Paul London. I remember that being really cool. Interactions with Spanky. I think one of the ones that I was most eager for when it happened was when he teamed with Curryman to take on Jado and Geto for the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Tag Team Championships in New Japan, because that was a really big deal and it circulated the message boards that I was a part of in my fandom. And I remember just trying to find any way that I could watch it as soon as it did happen because I wanted to be in the know. And I think luckily enough, we had the wrestling channel in the UK at the time, and through the ways of the internet, I may have found a way to have seen that match. And now it's on New Japan World, so it's something that I can go back and relive and watch with a different perspective. His performances would stand out just because I was enamored with his ability in the ring and the things that he would do. And he would evolve as months would go by, as he would be on a different learning tree. So I remember seeing distinct differences in the way that he would wrestle, adding little things from different elements. He would do things like a run to the corner, double step off, and then backflip over his opponent, which is something that you would only see mostly from high-flying wrestlers or luchadors. And even though he was a shorter competitor, he still looked stocky. He was always in great shape. So it wasn't something that you would think that he would do or be able to do. So that was really cool. And then he would always incorporate the hard-hitting strikes and a lot of the submission-style wrestling that was, I guess only seen by people like Dean Malenko before him. And that was something that resonated with me. So I've never had the opportunity to meet Bryan Danielson as a wrestler, but actually 1 year before I started professional wrestling training, I actually got to see him in Australia on a small tour that he did with World Series Wrestling, which is a company I get to work for now, which is very funny. He wrestled Nigel McGuinness at the UNSW Roundhouse in an amazing main event match that I never thought that I would see in my country, in my home city. It was still to this day one of my fondest memories, and just being one of the few fans that knew who these guys were, because there was other people like Billy Kidman and some other, ex-WWE or ex-mainstream wrestling company wrestlers on the card that I think a lot of the fans were there to see. But there were some eager independent wrestling fans in the building as well that wanted to see people like Bryan Danielson, like Nigel McGuinness. I'm pretty sure I told him, or somehow something came out, that me and my friends that were there were backyard wrestlers, and he didn't dismiss us. He was pretty cool about it, and I think he made the nod to go get trained and do it properly, which was definitely what I followed in the footsteps of doing. So, to me, there's so many things that he is known for, has done, that you're going to see in the ring today. I know guys like Pete Dunne throw out influences that they've obtained from Bryan Danielson in the ring all the time. Even things like gear being inspired by him, color schemes. Anytime you see anyone do an aeroplane spin for a long time, I always revert back to when Bryan Danielson used to do it in Ring of Honor. So I think his influence is going to be felt for a long time to come still, because there are still some younger wrestlers coming up now that aren't in that spotlight yet, that probably grew up with Bryan Danielson as an influence to them.
So there's two different sides to this coin when it comes to what makes Daniel Bryan great, what separates him as a performer. You have to understand that from a fan's perspective, he has a presence and he has a great skill set when it comes to technical wrestling and striking, and he's one of the first guys and one of the best guys on the United States independent scene to implement mixed martial arts, or jiu-jitsu most specifically, to implement stuff you'd only seen in UFC into his matches. The 10-6 elbows, the omoplata. These are things that nobody else was doing at the time, and he really brought that to the forefront. And from a wrestler's perspective, this guy had a wrestling IQ that was far beyond almost anybody that you'd come across. I mean, genius level. We're talking a guy who could put together a match. Doesn't matter where it was. He could wrestle in front of 12 people at a fairgrounds in Florida. He could wrestle in front of 2,000 people in Japan. He could wrestle in one of those camp shows in England. He could wrestle in Mexico in front of 10,000, and he would adapt and he would mold himself to those styles. And he was just so good at being flexible. He was able to excel in every style. So yeah, I worked Bryan a couple times. I might have worked him once or twice in FIP, but I worked him in Ring of Honor a couple times. And being in a match with a guy like that is a breeze, because they have such a great mind for professional wrestling. They have such a handle on how to put matches together, how to make things flow. And that part is always the hardest part. The physicality, for me anyways, was always easy. And luckily, Bryan, in spite of his technical prowess, knew how to bring it. I mean, you might not understand, but I've been kicked so hard by him that I could not feel my legs. Doesn't sound like something to be proud of, but hey, not many people can say they got kicked in the spine by the American Dragon and lived to tell the tale. So both of our matches, I think, were really good. I was very happy with them at the time. And it was just, not to sound like a dork, but it was an honor to wrestle Bryan Danielson at that point. He was just such an upper tier guy, such an elite level dude, that I was just happy to be in the same ring as him and to not look like a complete buffoon.
Hello, my name is Daniel Makabe, otherwise known as Daniel Makabe. I'm here to talk about Bryan Danielson, otherwise known as Daniel Bryan, otherwise known as probably the best pro wrestler of all time, and one of the biggest influences on me as a performer and a pro wrestler on the independent scene today. So just a quick background. Definitely the first time I ever heard of him or saw him was the ECWA Super 8 in 2001, which was kind of the big independent tournament at the time. There were no bolas, no 16 carats, no super strong styles, etc. Super 8 was the thing. He had an amazing run to the finals, including a great match against Loki in the finals. That was the first time I saw him. Afterwards, I was very lucky that because he was based in Aberdeen, Washington, which is not too far from where I was in the greater Vancouver area here in British Columbia, that ECCW would bring him up on a regular basis. So from the summer of 2001 up until, I'd say maybe 06, 07, we were seeing him pretty regularly here in the greater Vancouver area. Lots of classic matches at Bridgeview Hall in Surrey, British Columbia for ECCW. I recall specifically finals of Pacific Cup, which was ECCW's big tournament, against Scotty Mack one year. Matches against Aaron Idol, who is a name that no one will know, but he was someone who we really thought was an awesome performer here in Vancouver. Never really got his due, not wrestling anymore. Someone who was definitely before his time, unfortunately. But Bryan Danielson had amazing matches with those guys, and honestly, I don't know if there's ever been a more consistent performer ever in pro wrestling than Bryan Danielson. His ability to work as a technician and as a heel and really have a mat-based match, but also be very engaging to an audience. That's something that I'm very conscious of. When I'm working as a heel and I'm getting heat on someone, if I'm targeting a body part or trying to keep them grounded, I'm not, I'm very focused on them, but I'm also engaging with the people around me. I'm making sure that I'm very expressive with my face, and then at the same time, I know when to give that opponent the opportunity that they need to fire up and to make them look good and to sell for them. And that's something that Bryan Danielson was amazing at, making his opponents look just great, like $1 million. And doing so in a really, he just makes everything look so easy. Everything looks so easy to him, and I'm sure he's one of those guys who I just think is such a natural talent that we're all so jealous of, because a lot of us have to just work really hard for this sort of thing. I actually tape traded with him once when he was a regular here in ECCW. We used to bother him after shows. I got an All Japan Women's tape from him, and that's something that a fun little fact that I always like to throw out to people. He just seems like a genuine human being too. And I think there needs to be more people like that in this business. I think there are more people like that in this business. I think when he started, this is a very different business on the independents. But now you see a lot more people along the lines of Bryan Danielson, people who are in there because of the art form and because they care about the performance and because they appreciate getting to work with people and produce something that people are still talking about all these years later.
First time I heard about Bryan was when I had heard that 4 of Shawn Michaels' trainees had signed developmental deals. Lance Cade, Spanky, Shooter Schultz, and the American Dragon. And I thought that was, it's a funny name. I mean, I'm ChrisHero, so I'm going to talk about generic names, but the American Dragon just sounded kind of funny. I don't think I saw, I think I saw some Memphis developmental footage of him, whether it was, working with Reckless Youth or hearing about stuff he did with Regal. But then his Super 8 is where I saw him to go through, what would that have been? That would have been the year 2001, the Super 8, where he fought Key in the finals, and then they went and redid that match at King of the Indies later on that year. My initial thoughts, one, he had a funky mask, and I thought it was interesting to see him transition from the mask to not having the mask and just kind of looking like a guy. I always thought he had good technique. I enjoyed watching him because he always did interesting maneuvers on the mat and interesting ways to get into things. I think I liked his matches with Spanky the most at that time. They would just really tear into each other. I first met Danielson on a show in Austria, late 2003. And then, like 2 or 3 days later, I was flying to do a week of shows in England, and Bryan was my first opponent. I teamed with this guy named Kid Cool against Cannonball Grizzly, the former PN News, and the American Dragon, who was a heel. He wore his mask. And that was the, first time I'd really spent some time with Bryan. And then I would go on to wrestle him the following year for IWA Mid-South, and then a couple years later for Ring of Honor. And he was the kind of guy that would find something amusing personally, and then he would do his best to try to figure out a way to do it in matches, but to get a good reaction with it, not doing it just to doing it. But he would be extra amused if, like, for instance, we wanted to start winning matches with small packages because he wanted to cut a promo and say that, from here on out, everybody should call him Mr. Small Package. Obviously not realizing the connotation of the name. He just thought that was so funny. But then he turned it around and got the small package over as like an incredible finish. And that was because of how it was treated and how it was implemented into his matches. If I remember talking to him about his tours of New Japan, and he said something that was kind of interesting because everybody, and this is 2003 that I'm talking. So you're like, wow, Liger, he's a legend, and like Tiger Mask, like, wow, what a lineage, and he would say things like, he'd almost prefer to have matches with guys like Minoru Suzuki, who I did not know a whole lot of at that time. I knew he was shoot style, but I didn't know he would go on to be the interesting performer that he was in, the last 15 years of his career. So just to have that perception passed on to me was important.